The soldier never saw him. He was moving through a Finnish forest on the morning of December 21st, 1939, pushing through knee-deep snow with 40 other men, their brown greatcoats standing out like bruises against the white. The temperature was somewhere around minus 35 degrees Celsius. The trees were silent. The air had that particular stillness that comes just before something terrible happens. The first shot came from nowhere. One man dropped. Then another, then a third. The column broke apart, men diving behind trees, pressing themselves into snowdrifts, screaming in Russian about an ambush. But there was no ambush. There was no muzzle flash. There was no puff of steam rising from a rifle. There was nothing, only the white and the cold and the dead. By the time the last survivor ran, 25 Soviet soldiers lay motionless in that forest. The shooter had never moved from his position. He had never been seen. He was already still again, a shadow beneath the snow, his heartbeat slow, his breath silent, because he held compacted snow in his mouth to stop it turning to vapor in the frozen air. His name was Simo Häyhä. He was 34 years old. He was a farmer. And on that single day, he set a kill record that no sniper in any war has ever matched. If you've never heard of Simo Häyhä, you're about to understand why military historians consider him the most lethal individual soldier in the history of modern warfare, and why the question isn't just how many men he killed, but why the most effective sniper who ever lived deliberately chose to do it without one of the most basic tools of his trade. If stories like this are what you're here for, documented, verified, no exaggeration, subscribe to this channel, ring the bell, and stay with me, because this story deserves to be told properly. To understand Simo Häyhä, you have to understand where he came from. Not just Finland, but a specific corner of Finland that shaped everything about the man he became. He was born on December 17, 1905, in the municipality of Rautjärvi, in a region called Karelia, pressed against the Russian border in southeastern Finland. The seventh of 8 children in a Lutheran farming family. His father owned a farm called Mattila. The land was beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Dense boreal forest, frozen lakes, winters that could kill a man who didn't know what he was doing. Simo learned to shoot the way Finnish boys in Karelia learned to shoot, young and in the woods and with serious purpose. Hunting wasn't recreation in that part of the world. It was food. It was survival. By the time he was a teenager, he was already an exceptional marksman, spending hours in the forest tracking small game with a bolt-action rifle. The iron sights on that rifle, the simple, unadorned metal sights that were standard on working guns, were as familiar to him as the shape of his own hands. He completed his mandatory military service in 1927, trained as a sniper, and when it was over, he went back to the farm. He joined the Finnish Civil Guard, a voluntary defense organization, and competed in shooting competitions. He was very good. He kept his skills sharp, not because he expected to need them, but because it was simply part of who he was. By 1939, Simo Häyhä was a quiet 34-year-old farmer. He liked dogs. He liked hunting. He kept to himself. He had no way of knowing that within a few months his name would become the most feared 2 words in the Red Army. The Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939. Joseph Stalin had expected it to be easy. The math was, on its face, absurd in his favor. The USSR had roughly 750,000 soldiers available for the campaign. Finland had around 300,000 in its entire army. The Red Army had nearly 6,000 tanks. Finland had a handful. Soviet air power outnumbered Finnish aircraft by more than 30-1. Stalin himself reportedly told his inner circle that Finland would fall within 2 weeks. His generals agreed. His diplomats had already drawn up maps of the post-war Soviet territory. What no one in the Kremlin adequately accounted for was Finland itself. Stalin had also spent the previous years methodically executing his most experienced military commanders during the Great Purge. The men who had built Soviet tactical doctrine, the officers who understood logistics, the generals who knew how to fight a complex combined arms campaign, many of them were dead or broken. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, perhaps the Red Army's most innovative strategic mind, had been shot in 1937. What was left was an enormous army led by men who had risen not through competence, but through survival of the purge, and who now had to fight a winter war in a terrain they didn't understand, against an enemy they had catastrophically underestimated. The terrain itself was a weapon. Karelia and the land approaches from the east were not open steppe where Soviet armor could maneuver freely. They were dense forest, cut by rivers and frozen lakes, with roads that funneled mechanized columns into narrow corridors where they could not spread out, could not flank, could not use their numerical superiority. Every road became a potential kill zone. Every tree line was a hiding place. Finland's strategy was simple and brutal. Don't fight them straight. Use the land, use the cold, use the forests. Let the Red Army's size become its liability. Finnish soldiers moved on skis, silent and swift, capable of covering ground that left Soviet soldiers struggling through hip-deep snow on foot. Most Soviet units had no skis at all and no meaningful training for winter operations in extreme cold. Finnish troops wore white camouflage suits that rendered them nearly invisible against the landscape. Soviet soldiers wore brown greatcoats that stood out against the snow like targets. Finnish fighters knew every trail, every frozen crossing, every sightline and choke point in the Karelian forests. Many of them had hunted these woods their entire lives. The Red Army was fighting in what was, to them, essentially an alien planet, hostile terrain, hostile weather, and an enemy who seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, kill, and vanish. The early weeks of the war were catastrophic for the Soviets. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed in engagements that became legendary in Finnish military history. The Battle of Suomussalmi, the Rate Road disaster, the grinding attrition along the Mannerheim line. The world watched, stunned, as the largest army on earth bled against a nation of 4 million people. And into this nightmare, the Red Army walked. Straight into the operational sector assigned to Simo Häyhä. He was assigned to a position along the Kola River, a stretch of the front where Finnish forces were desperately outnumbered and holding on through ferocity and terrain rather than numbers. Häyhä was one man. He was issued a Finnish-made Mosin Nagant M28-30, a modified version of the standard Russian bolt-action rifle, slightly shorter, slightly heavier, deeply reliable. The Finns called it the pistikorva, the pointy ear, for the distinctive ears around its front sight. He wore a white camouflage suit over his winter clothes. He went into the forest before dawn. He found a position, and he waited. What followed over the next 100 days would be unprecedented in the recorded history of warfare. But there is something that needs to be understood before we go further, something that people who hear Häyhä's story almost always misunderstand. Because when you tell someone that the deadliest sniper in history didn't use a scope, the natural assumption is that this was some kind of challenge, a personal statement, a refusal born of arrogance or tradition or stubbornness. It was nothing of the sort. Häyhä's decision to use iron sights was a calculated tactical choice, one made by a man who had thought through the physics of staying alive and effective in that specific environment with a clarity that would have impressed any professional military planner. Consider the conditions first. -35, -40 degrees Celsius. The optical glass in a telescopic sight, under those temperatures, fogs. It clouds from the inside as the temperature differential between the glass and the air causes condensation that freezes in the mechanism. A scope that works perfectly at room temperature becomes a clouded, unreliable instrument in the Finnish winter, and it becomes that instrument at exactly the moment you cannot afford unreliability. A sniper who raises his rifle and sees nothing but fog has made a possibly fatal mistake. Iron sights have no glass. They don't fog. They don't freeze. In the Finnish winter, they work when nothing else does. Then consider the geometry of exposure. A sniper using a telescopic sight must raise his head several centimeters higher to align his eye with the optic. Several centimeters. That sounds like nothing. In a combat environment, lying behind a snowbank at -40 degrees with a Soviet counter-sniper somewhere in the tree line looking for any sign of movement, those centimeters are the difference between invisible and visible. Häyhä operated from positions so compressed against the ground that he built up small snowdrifts around himself to further break his outline, and the snowbanks served a second purpose. They absorbed the recoil of his shots, preventing the snow beneath the muzzle from kicking up in a visible puff that an enemy observer could locate. Every centimeter of exposure was a centimeter he was not willing to give up. Iron sights allowed him to stay lower, so he used iron sights. Then consider the light. In the Finnish winter, with snow covering every surface, the sun, when it appears, creates an almost blinding reflected glare across the landscape. A scope lens catches that light. A single flash, a single glint off optical glass, visible from hundreds of meters away, is enough for a trained observer to locate a position. Häyhä himself had learned to watch for exactly that. The glint of Soviet scope glass in the tree line was one of his methods for identifying targets before they knew he was there. He knew what it looked like, he knew what it cost, and he was not going to offer the same vulnerability to whoever was hunting him. Consider also the reliability question. A telescopic sight is a precise mechanical instrument with multiple glass elements, adjustable mounts, and calibrated internals. In extreme cold, lubricants thicken, metal contracts, fine adjustments drift. A scope zeroed at normal temperatures may shoot several inches off after prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Häyhä's iron sights had no moving parts, no glass, no lubricant to thicken. They were a fixed piece of metal. They were always zeroed. And finally, and this may be the most decisive factor of all, Häyhä had spent roughly 20 years shooting with iron sights. Not just target shooting, hunting, for real animals, in real weather, with real stakes. His muscles had built a knowledge of those sights that lived below conscious thought. He didn't aim with them, he pointed, the way a man with decades of practice points his finger at something across a room. He later told interviewers that he zeroed his M28-30 at approximately 150 meters and worked primarily within that distance, using terrain, patience, and movement to close range rather than optics to extend it. A tool you know with complete fluency, deployed in conditions you understand completely, will outperform a better tool that you trust less. This is not a philosophical position. It is physics and psychology. And for Simo Häyhä, in the winter of 1939, it was a decision that kept him alive and lethal for 100 consecutive days. This was not primitive. This was mastery. By mid-December 1939, Soviet commanders along the Kola were receiving reports they could barely process. A Finnish sniper, possibly one man, possibly several, was killing their soldiers at a rate that had no precedent. Units refused to advance. Men who had survived combat in other theaters were terrified to expose themselves for even a moment. Soldiers began carrying large iron shields into the field, propped against the snow, trying to create cover from a threat they couldn't locate. The reports described a ghost, a shadow, something that killed without warning and without position, that left only bodies and silence. The Soviets tried everything. They sent counter-snipers, trained Soviet marksmen whose specific task was to locate and eliminate Häyhä. These were not inexperienced men. Soviet sniper doctrine was well developed, and the men dispatched to find the White Death were skilled at their craft. None succeeded. In his own memoirs, Häyhä described at least one encounter in which he detected he was being tracked, likely from the subtle misalignment of shadow or a pattern of movement that didn't fit the terrain, relocated without being seen, and then turned the hunt around. The Soviet sniper who had been hunting him was eliminated at long range. The Soviet sniper never saw him. They organized artillery barrages on entire sections of forest. Not targeting a specific position, they couldn't find a specific position, but attempting to saturate large areas with shellfire on the probability that Häyhä was somewhere inside them. The forest absorbed the artillery. The shells churned the snow and splintered the pines and created craters that refroze into treacherous ice. Häyhä moved when he needed to and returned when the barrage ended. The artillery killed trees. It did not kill him. They sent infantry units specifically tasked with locating and killing him. Those units suffered casualties and withdrew without results. The psychological effect on Soviet forces along the Kola became a factor in itself. Fear is contagious in combat in a way that orders cannot always overcome. When soldiers know, genuinely believe, that any exposed movement may be the last movement they ever make, the aggregate effect on unit cohesion and offensive capability is significant. Soviet troops along Häyhä's sector developed what their own commanders described as paralysis, an unwillingness to advance, to move through open ground, to do the ordinary things that offensive operations require. One man, with a bolt-action rifle and iron sights, had effectively neutralized entire units without ever engaging them directly. On February 17, 1940, 80 days after the Soviet invasion, Finnish High Command pulled Häyhä from the front for a ceremony. He was officially proclaimed a hero of Finland and awarded the Cross of Kolla, a decoration specifically created to honor those who had held the line on that desperate stretch of river. His cross was numbered 4, behind only Marshal Mannerheim, President Kallio, and his division commander. His division commander, Colonel Antero Svensson, promoted him and credited him with hundreds of kills. Among his fellow soldiers, he was spoken of with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. He went back to the front. The numbers surrounding Häyhä's kill count deserve careful handling, because this channel does not deal in exaggeration, and the historical record here is genuinely complex. The most commonly cited figure is 505 confirmed sniper kills, achieved in roughly 100 days. His division commander's official record listed 219 confirmed rifle kills. A military chaplain who kept a contemporaneous diary recorded 259. Finnish military historian Tapio Saarelainen, who interviewed Häyhä dozens of times between 1997 and 2002, put the total, combining all weapon types, as high as 542 in his book The White Sniper. And in Häyhä's own private war memoir, written in 1940 and hidden for 77 years until its discovery in 2017, the man himself estimated he had killed approximately 500 Soviet soldiers. He called the list his Sintiluettelo, his sin list. Additional kills with a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun, in his role as a squad leader, were counted separately and not included in the sniper totals. What can be said with confidence? No sniper in any major documented conflict has come close to matching Häyhä's rate of kills in a comparable time frame. Whatever the exact figure, and the variance comes from the fog of war and the chaos of a desperate defensive campaign, not from fabrication. What happened along the Kola River in the winter of 1939 was singular. The Red Army knew it. The Finnish Army knew it. Häyhä himself knew it, though he would spend the rest of his life declining to speak of it with anything resembling pride. March 6, 1940. 105 days after the Soviet invasion began. The day started like the others, cold, white, silent in the particular way that Finnish winter mornings were silent along the Kola, the kind of silence where sound carries with unusual clarity through air that is too cold to hold much else. Häyhä was in position. The routine was what it had always been. Move before dawn, find ground, settle, wait. Let the forest become familiar with you. Let your heart beat slow, and your breath discipline itself. Watch. A Soviet soldier, whose name has not survived the historical record, caught a glimpse of something in the snow that didn't belong. A shape. A shadow that sat slightly wrong against the white. He raised his rifle. The bullet was explosive. A round specifically designed to cause maximum tissue damage on impact. It struck Simo Häyhä in the lower left jaw. The soldiers who found him reported that half of his face was missing. They loaded him onto a sled and pulled him toward a field hospital, and the accounts suggest that almost everyone involved believed they were carrying a dead man. The doctors who received him stabilized him. They made no promises. Häyhä slipped into a coma. He remained unconscious for 11 days. On March 13, 1940, he opened his eyes. Finland and the Soviet Union had signed the Moscow Peace Treaty the same morning. The Winter War was over. Finland had ceded significant territory to the USSR, the Karelian Isthmus, the shores of Lake Ladoga, the Hanko Peninsula. Häyhä's own birthplace of Rautjärvi was now on the Soviet side of the border. He would never be able to return to his family farm, the land where he had learned to shoot, the forests where he had spent his childhood. But Finland had survived as an independent nation. The Red Army, which had expected to steamroll a small Nordic country in a matter of weeks, had spent 3.5 brutal months bleeding against Finnish resistance and paid an enormous price. Soviet casualties in the Winter War are estimated at between 125,000 and over 160,000 dead, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. In a campaign they had believed would require almost no effort at all, Finland lost approximately 25,000 men. The humiliation of the Winter War had a consequence beyond Finland's borders. Adolf Hitler, observing the Red Army's dismal performance against a small Nordic nation, drew conclusions about Soviet military capability that would shape his decision to invade the USSR in June 1941. Historians continue to debate the precise weight of that factor, but the strategic ripples from the Finnish forest ran farther than anyone in Rautjärvi could have imagined. Häyhä spent years recovering from his wound. His face was permanently disfigured, rebuilt through a series of surgeries that gave him back function but not the face he had before. When he was well enough, he returned to what he had always been, a farmer. He found a new home near the Soviet border, because that was the landscape he knew, and he worked the land and went hunting with his dog, Kille, and lived a quiet life. Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the supreme commander of Finnish forces, promoted Häyhä from the lowest non-commissioned rank directly to officer rank on August 28, 1940, a leap that had almost no precedent in Finnish military history. In 1941, he was nominated for the Mannerheim Cross, Finland's highest military honor, though bureaucratic circumstances prevented the formal award. He received the numbered Cross of Kola, his bearing the number 4, behind only Marshal Mannerheim, the President of Finland, and his division commander. He did not speak about the war. Not for decades. Finnish journalists who found him in his later years described a man of extraordinary modesty, someone who answered questions briefly, deflected any suggestion of heroism, and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. When a reporter asked him in 1998 how he had become such a good sniper, he answered in one word: practice. In December 2001, shortly before his 96th birthday, a journalist from the Finnish newspaper Helsingin Sanomat asked him whether he felt remorse for having killed so many people. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did what I was told as well as I could. There would be no Finland unless everyone had done the same." Simo Häyhä died on April 1, 2002. He was 96 years old. He was buried in his hometown. There is a version of Simo Häyhä's story that gets told in certain corners of the internet, the mythological version, where he becomes something superhuman, a killing machine, an avatar of cold death. That version misses everything important about him. The real story is about a farmer who knew a piece of ground and knew a season and knew a rifle with a depth of knowledge that most soldiers never achieve, who looked at a telescopic scope and saw not an advantage but a liability, glass that would fog, glint, and raise his profile by centimeters that could get him killed, who chose iron sights not out of stubbornness but out of a clear-eyed understanding of physics and terrain and survival. It's a story about the difference between technology and mastery, about the fact that the most effective tool in any environment is not necessarily the most sophisticated one, but the one that works reliably in the specific conditions you face, operated by someone who has spent a lifetime learning its limits. And it's a story about cost. Häyhä never boasted. He called his list of kills his sin list. The man who held Soviet forces at bay along the Kala, who may have done as much to preserve Finnish independence as any general or policy, spent the rest of his life as a quiet man with a disfigured face, living near a border that had swallowed his childhood home, with a hunting dog and a piece of farmland and a private accounting of what war had required of him. He did what he was told as well as he could. In the winter of 1939 and 1940, in temperatures that could kill an unprepared man in hours, in a forest that became a killing ground, that was enough. That was more than enough. If this is the kind of military history you want, documented, verified, no mythology, no exaggeration, subscribe to this channel. There's a lot more where this came from. Hit the like button, share this video with anyone who you think would appreciate it, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. History doesn't need to be dressed up. It just needs to be told.